Hello, folks. It's the Bradley J. Show once again with Rich Rubino, who's a political historian and commenter. And today we're going to address why we are so divided. Why is the nation divided? I have my theory. I know, but I'll let Rich go first. But before we do that, please, I want to remind you folks to buy Rich's book and to subscribe to my channel, my travel channel. It's called Bradley J. Travel. And just got back from another trip doing video in Jerusalem. Then prior to that was Morocco and Spain. Now, Rich here, he's got a book. It's an awesome book. It's a trivia book, and he's got it right at his fingertips, right, Rich? To show us. To show
right
us.
here, the Great American Political Trivia Challenge, political trivia on steroids.
That's right. We're at the halfway mark to Christmas time, and so beat the
Christmas
rush.
July, yes.
Beat the rush. So I'm pretty, Rich, I'm pretty sure I know why we're so divided. But not only are you going to give us your theory on why we're divided, but you're going to give us reference points to see, are we really all that divided? Have things been more divided before, etc.?
Yes.
And so I'm guessing you'd have to say that we're pretty divided during the Civil War.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Not only the Civil War, but before the Civil War as well. And the period before the Civil War, you had many divisions. You had divisions over the role of government, which has been divisions from time immemorial. You had divisions within the Republican Party. You had, amongst Republicans, you had folks like Abraham Lincoln, who were kind of moderates on the issue, who did not want to abolish slavery in the Confederate States, the 13 Confederate States, but wanted not to have them in the new territories in the West. You had abolitionists, what were called radical Republicans, like John C. Fremont, who was actually the first Republican presidential nominee in 1856, who said that we should abolish slavery everywhere. On the Democratic Party, there were actually some Democrats who were opposed to slavery. They were a very small faction. There were those who supported popular sovereignty, folks like Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, meaning essentially that the state should be able to decide. And there were those mostly Southern Democrats who supported slavery outright as an institution. And the interesting thing about Lincoln, by the way, we look at him today and the first thing you think of, you say he abolished the slaves. But he abolished he abolished slavery rather. But if you look at history, actually, there was a division in the Republican Party. And in 1864, and this kind of sounds familiar to contemporaneous times, there was actually a third party that was popping up, and it was actually formed, and John C. Fremont was going to be the nominee. And their basic plan was they wanted to scare the Republican Party to nominate somebody other than Abraham Lincoln, because they thought Abraham Lincoln was too soft on slavery. He was not truly an abolitionist. He hadn't done enough. And accordingly, they wanted somebody who would be a true abolitionist. So they actually had John C. Fremont as their nominee. But the Republican Party did nominate Abraham Lincoln. And then that third party thought, we're not going to be a spoiler. We don't want to give the election to General McClellan, the Democratic nominee. So we're going to bow out of the race. But John C. Fremont wrote this huge letter. And in this letter, he basically said that Abraham Lincoln was very much disappointing. He was not really one of us. So it's interesting to look at history today, and Lincoln is seen as kind of an abolitionist. But there was certainly division in that time. There was division after the Civil War as well. Certainly over the 15th Amendment, which allowed former slaves, African Americans, to vote. There was division over that, over Reconstruction, how the country's going to reconstruct after slavery, after the Civil War. So that was certainly a time when there was division. And actually, the time between what's called the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is roughly from the 1870s to the 1890s. You had a very similar time to what's going on now in terms of the presidential elections were very divided, and you did not have landslide elections.
Why were they gilded?
Because they
were building the railroads. That was at the John C. Calhoun time.
No. John C. Calhoun. He's an interesting figure. He was actually one of two people in American history, the other being George Clinton, who was actually vice president under two administrations. He was vice president under John Quincy Adams, 1825 to 1829. And then he stayed around and he became vice president to Andrew Jackson. And then he had a falling out over Andrew Jackson over the nullification crisis and actually left the administration, quit. Him and Spear Wagner, the only two people ever to quit at vice president. And
I shouldn't have said, I was way off with my Calhoun. But you know, those barons, the time when there were about 5 people, the railroad dude, the steel dude, that was the Gilded Age.
Yeah, that was the
Carnegie.
That was the Gilded Age.
Yeah, okay.
And in that time, you had elections like 1876, when you had a disputed election where Rutherford B. Hayes actually lost. Not only did he lose a plurality of the vote, he lost the majority of the vote. Samuel Tilden was the governor of New York, and he won 51% of the vote that year. It's the only time somebody's actually won an outright majority of the vote and still lost in the Electoral College to Rutherford B. Hayes. At the end of the day, there was a commission formed, and they made a deal essentially for this disputed election. The Democrats would stop their objections to Rutherford B. Hayes, the governor of Ohio, Republican, becoming president. In turn, Rutherford B. Hayes would agree to take all the troops that were protecting the South during Reconstruction, to take them away, essentially, even though Rutherford B. Hayes was very liberal on race himself. That was essentially the deal, and Rutherford B. Hayes agreed only to serve one term, and he kept that pledge. He did not run for re-election in 1880. In 1880, there was another disputed election. It was a very close election, very close election. James Carville just barely squeaked out a victory. 1884, it actually came. This is fascinating. It actually came down. We talk about the robber barons. Grover Cleveland's the incumbent president. I mean, he's the governor of New York, running for the Democratic president, for the Democratic nomination, wins the nomination, and the Republicans nominate James G. Blaine of Maine. And 2 days before the election, James G. Blaine is sitting there, and there's a fellow named Samuel Burchard, who's a Presbyterian minister. And he's addressing the Democratic Party, and he calls them the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Now, the Democratic Party was comprised of a lot of Irish Catholics, so he says rum, he's implying that they're alcoholics. He says Romanism, he's implying that their real allegiance is not to the United States of America, but to the Vatican. And he says rebellion, meaning they're going to rebel against the United States. So James G. Blaine did not try to disassociate himself. He actually ignored the remarks. This galvanized the Democratic Party and helped Grover Cleveland win his home state of New York, which he barely won his home state of New York by about 1,067 votes, probably because of what happened with Samuel Burchard. And talk about political naivete, just lack of political dexterity. A few days before the election, James G. Blaine dined with some of those robber barons, and there was a political cartoon showing him with those respective robber barons. So James G. Blaine probably could have been president had it not been for his own mistakes. But that was a very close election.
Got to ask you a question at some point.
Yes.
Civil War time, talking about slavery, and that was an unresolved thing during the founding months. And for the longest time, I kind of let those founders that were slave owners off the hook. But slavery was so awful that it seemed like really not only the abstract notion of it, but the violence and cruelty of it. I just watched Django Unchained again, and I don't know, I have trouble letting them off the hook for that. Jefferson was an owner, right?
Yep.
Washington was an owner.
All the Virginian presidents were amongst the first presidents.
I don't know. I do you think that detracts? Is that a mark?
Oh, it's absolutely a demerit on their legacies, and Jefferson specifically, because in Jefferson's case, not only was he a slave owner, but he also impregnated Sally Hemings.
Yeah, more than once, right?
Yes,
multiple
absolutely.
times.
And she was underage.
So, I know that you have to judge things largely in the context of the time,
right?
But some things are so awful that that's not even okay in the context of the time. The violence and the way that families were torn apart and people were beaten and killed and tortured, and I don't know.
Well, and even in that time, it was not monolithic in terms of supporting slavery. There are plenty of people. I mean, here in Massachusetts, the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison, there were newspapers. There were plenty of Americans who were against slavery. It's not like it was a 99% thing where every American was supportive of this institution. And even in the South, there were plenty of people who were very much opposed to it. There was liberation, like John Brown did at Harper's Ferry, for example. So there were very much multiple sides of that issue. And Abraham Lincoln's basic view was, he said, "I will preserve the Union if it's free, and I will preserve it if it's with slavery or without slavery.
Right, that was his prime. That was his big thing. He wasn't primarily an abolitionist. He was
no, not at
primarily
all.
a union saver.
And there were a lot of people in the Republican Party, and including at the 1860 in Chicago, his home state, they had the Republican convention, and there were plenty of Republicans who were called radical Republicans who were running that year who wanted to abolish slavery, and Lincoln was seen as the more moderate candidate because Abraham Lincoln said, "No, we're going to keep it in the old Confederacy. I don't want it in the new territories."
So we were certainly divided in the Civil War, and then
And after,
and after, and then you get into the late 60s, 68, 69.
oh yes,
That whole time, I mean, that was a different kind of division. That was a generational division, more than what we have now. Now we
Yeah.
have a right-left division, or we can talk about this later. An educated versus non-educated division. I think that's an unaddressed and one of the key things. When you see the people at the Capitol, you didn't see highly educated people storming the Capitol, did
there
you?
were some. There were
There
some.
were some,
Yeah,
but you know what I'm saying.
yeah.
The uneducated, dis, they despise the educated because the educated look down on them, and the educated
Oh, absolutely.
does look down on them, etc. But in the 60, 68, 69, 70,
Oh, absolutely.
that was a kind of a generational thing. You had squares, you had your Nixons, and then you had your kids, and they were wildly apart. You know, they much more apart than now.
It was yeah. It was almost bi-directional in the 1960s. I think Lyndon Johnson's administration was really an inflection point in terms of division between right and left in two different ways. First of all, in part on the Civil Rights Act, the beginning of you can separate Lyndon Johnson into the first 2 years, 1964, 1965, which was really kind of the high tide of liberalism in America. And the second 2 years, 66, 67, I guess the last three years, 68, when Vietnam, when Vietnam essentially took over, became hegemonic in his administration. So the first 2 years, the division is largely within the Democratic Party. And this is something that doesn't get talked about, but there's an ideological sorting. There used to be, the Democratic Party was comprised of Northern liberals, Northern and Midwestern liberals, folks like Hubert Humphrey, Eugene McCarthy, George McGovern, and Southern Democrats. And in the Civil Rights battle in 1964, every solitary Northern Democrat, non-Southern Democrat, except for Robert Byrd of West Virginia, voted for the Civil Rights Act. Every Southern Democrat, except Ralph Yarborough of Texas, voted against it. So the ideological sorting, largely after Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, many Southern conservatives largely abandoned the Democratic Party and became Republicans, and African Americans who were the Republican Party's most loyal constituency at one time. It actually began around during the Hoover administration, because Hoover was seen as unresponsive during the Depression, continued under Franklin Roosevelt, and really proliferated when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. The story is that Johnson, the next day, Jack Valenti walks into the Oval Office, and Lyndon Johnson's sitting there, and he's disconsolate, and he's looking down, and Jack Valenti says, "Why, you just signed one of the most historic pieces of legislation in the history of America." He says, "You're going to be one of the greatest presidents since Lincoln on civil rights." And Johnson said, "We've just given the cell to the Republicans for 50 years. And on the other side of that, Barry Goldwater, who was the Republican nominee, who voted against the Civil Rights Act, not because he was a racist, he was actually a member of the NAACP, but because of a libertarian grounds, he did not think the federal government constitutionally could mandate desegregation. He could mandate essentially the Civil Rights Act. He thought it was not constitutionally permissible. Said we have to go where the ducks are. Now, what does that mean? He means that essentially we have to go for white Southern voters who are very traditionally Democrat. They were called Yellow Dog Democrats. That slogan came from 1928 when Al Smith, a Catholic, was the Democratic nominee. And some Democrats were saying in the South were saying we can't support our nominee because he's Catholic. We're gonna have to support Herbert Hoover. The slogan was, well, we'll support a Democrat if it's a yellow dog. So in 1964, gradually these white Southerners started to become Republicans, and you had the ending of this kind of sea change with African Americans becoming predominantly Democrats. In 1964, For example, Barry Goldwater won 6% of the African American vote. Eisenhower had won just 8 years earlier, upwards of 30% of the African American vote. Jackie Robinson had supported Richard Nixon largely in the 1960 presidential election. So there were a lot of African Americans who had been supporting of the Republican Party, and they believed that they were supporters of civil rights. Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act, for example, in 1957, and there were plenty of liberal Republicans, moderate Republicans in the House and the Senate who were supportive of the Civil Rights Act, but gradually they became Republicans. 1968, there was a little bit of a stop there because George Wallace was the American Party, the American Independent Party's nominee. He was the governor of Alabama, so he won 39 electoral votes, but all from southern states. Richard Nixon, 1972, picked up the entire South. He picked up all 49 states that year. Then there was a little respite in 1976 because you had Jimmy Carter, the first Southerner since Zachary Taylor in 1848, to win a major part to become president. He won the Democratic Party nomination. Then the Ronald Reagan brought a lot of those Southern conservatives back, and some of them even voted Democrat local elections, but they did not do it at the federal election. So what is this called? I call it an ideological sorting. Essentially, what you have now is the divisions are not. You always had the divisions, but the divisions used to be between conservative Democrat and liberal Democrat, conservative Republican and liberal Republican. Now they're not within the parties. They're between the parties. There's only 9 members of the Blue Dog Conservative Democratic Caucus. Only 9. There were 65 in 2008. Gradually, the Southern conservatives either lost re-election or did not seek re-election and were supplanted by a Republican. Now, the Blue Dog Democrats, for example, the heads are from Washington State, Alaska, and Maine. There really are no longer these kind of white Southern conservative Democrats. And on the Republican side, they're no longer liberal Republicans. And interestingly, I'll just end with this. Last year, the 3 most popular governors in the country were Charlie Baker of Massachusetts, Larry Hogan of Maryland, and Phil Scott of Vermont. There's one common denominator between all 3 of them. They're all Republicans who represent predominantly Democratic states where they have a supermajority in the legislature. They're all moderate Republicans, and they represented the 3 best states for Joe Biden in 2020, all represented by a Republican. They're the last vestige.
So you do say that the division is not so much inter-party, but between parties. However,
yes,
Marjorie Taylor Greene gets kicked out of the Freedom Caucus. That's crazy. That's definitely a side conversation. But you have the Freedom Caucus, and you have that whole problem electing or getting McCarthy to be Speaker. So that was an example of some division within the party. And I want to ask you as a historian, has it always been the case that we had people and very powerful, like Marjorie Taylor Greene raises more money than anybody else for that wing? She raises a lot of money. She's really, really powerful. But she believes crazy things. Really has said crazy, crazy things. In the past, have you had people in power that were that much of that wing nutty?
I mean, obviously, yeah, if you're looking at the times, I can't think of anybody who, for example, was elected and said what she had said prior to being elected to Congress. And there's actually video. She thinks, for example, that the Clintons had JFK Jr. killed in 1999 so that Hillary Clinton could run for the Senate seat in New York. It's kind of interesting because a lot of the folks in QAnon actually believe that JFK Jr. is still alive and that he's coming back and he's going to be Donald Trump's running mate. So those 2 things could not be true. So there's fissures, I think, within QAnon even between, is JFK Jr. still alive and will he be the vice presidential nominee, or did the Clintons kill him? And which is what Marjorie Taylor Greene had actually said. She becomes a Republican. When she gets elected, she essentially, his first year in office, she's literally is not on. They don't let her on a committee. They vote against her with the Democratic-controlled Congress. Kevin McCarthy comes in, agrees to put her on committees, and she's actually somewhat, to the extent that she can, she's mainstreamed herself in terms of supporting Kevin McCarthy, right, the establishment candidate,
because she promised her so much,
and she got it. And on the debt ceiling, she voted with Kevin McCarthy. in terms of raising the debt ceiling against folks like Lori Bobart, Ed Matt Gates, and members of the Freedom Caucus. So she's actually positioning herself as somewhat of an ideological pragmatist, which I don't think anyone really expected. Now, is she still the same rhetoric? Yes, the rhetoric is essentially the exact same, but she's somewhat of a pragmatist, and she actually does try to be. She actually tries to do the job of a congressman, for example. And Joe Biden, his infrastructure bill that he signed, he actually was going to Marjorie Taylor Greene's district to talk about a program, to talk about that Marjorie Taylor Greene had actually tried to get in the infrastructure bill. So she actually is working as a regular congressperson in many respects.
I guess the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, was that fight between her and Boebert over who would get to impeach Biden. And they had this public argument on the floor, and I guess Green called Boebert the B word or something like that.
Yes.
Just so awful. Okay. So QAnon, do you think they believe what those things, or do you think they do that for attention?
No, I think
like flat Earth people, I think they do that to get attention.
I think there are some people who believe. I do think in both the flat Earth and QAnon, and I'm sure there's some overlap there. I do think the fact that people go to all these rallies, and they'll go around the country, they'll go to all these rallies, and they'll espouse what they believe, even to reporters, and they'll say it in a very monotone way. I mean, it's not like something that they're unnecessarily trying to. It's not necessarily something that they're trying to put emotion. They're trying to provoke variety in their voice. No, I think they actually believe it. Now,
so the fact that they go to these things, says to me that it's their identity, it's their hobby. Like instead of knitting or that's their hobby and their identity, and so that's why they say it and do it. It gets them attention. It gives them an identity.
I think that there is some of that. I mean, I think that there are some people who really believe it. The fact that people actually went to Dallas waiting for JFK Jr. to appear, but I think that the affinity group part is very much a part of politics. Negative tribalism.
Yeah.
The idea of, and there's positive tribalism too. There's different types of tribalism. Tribalism, if you're a diehard Oakland Athletics fan and you root for the Oakland Athletics and you want to go to all the games and everyone there is also a root for Oakland Athletics, that's tribalism. It doesn't necessarily hurt anybody, but it's tribalism because you're rooting for the Oakland Athletics and the other team, the Cleveland Indians, that's their tribe.
They call it benign tribalism, not necessarily positive tribalism.
It's benign. Yeah, I mean, it's benign. I mean, it doesn't
do anybody any good.
I mean, in many respects, you say, why are you spending so much time? If you're not, it's one thing if you're an actual player, but if you're a fan and you really devote your life to the Oakland Athletics, then it doesn't. The point is, it doesn't necessarily hurt anybody. But some people, politics has become an outgrowth of that. In politics, right. And it's not even Republicans or Democrats. I mean, if you talk to many Trump people, and they say, whether you talk about the Republican Party, you talk about the establishment, you talk about the Bushes, you talk about Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy, they're almost the Antichrist. It's not that they like the Republican Party. It's they like the idea of calling themselves conservative or populist, and the idea that the other side is part of this, Marxist, Leninist, communist conspiracy. And to be fair, on the left side, there are certainly affinity groups as well. I think there's an affinity group of folks on the left who, for example, would support someone like Ralph Nader or Cornel West. And if you listen to their rhetoric, when you talk about the Democratic Party, they say the Democratic Party is neoliberal, and they'll say that the Democratic Party is essentially become the party of warmongers, and they're going to start World War III in the Ukraine. So that is one faction within the party, and then you have the more establishment wing of the Democratic Party. And just like they're always trying to essentially say that we're more pragmatic, but they both don't like the other side. They don't like the Republican Party. It's just a matter of gradation.
An example of the left and their affinity group would be the Kennedy people, the people that want Kennedy to run against Biden.
But that's almost more people on the right. It's interesting. I mean, folks like Roger Stone, and a lot of the people who are his benefactors who are supporting him are not traditional Democrats. These aren't people from the left. They're people who get their identity in being anti-Biden. I think it's not so much anti-Biden as much as it's being anti-establishment. It's being anti-vaccine mandate, anti-mask mandate, anti-lockdowns. And I think that there are a lot of people that are also Trump supporters who support Kennedy, or they'll say, well, Kennedy should be on the ticket. We should have a bipartisan ticket. But the problem is, if you listen to Kennedy's actual announcement speech, he did it in Boston. People had signs, "This is Kennedy country," so he was trying to do everything he can about his name. But if you listen to what he's actually saying, he's in many respects running from the left. He is running on the left, but he also is he's running on the left when he talks about vaccines, and he's saying that, or not so much vaccines per se, but he talks about the lockdowns and said the lockdowns hurt the poor, for example. But he also blames it on Donald Trump. He said that Donald Trump listened to Fauci, Donald Trump supported some of these lockdowns. So he kind of runs almost to the right of Donald Trump in that respect. But the problem with him is he's got the same problem Joe Lieberman had, the same problem Tulsi Gabbard had. He's every Democrat, he's every Republican's favorite Democrat, and that does not bode well in a party that is predominantly
Right.
now a moderate or a liberal party.
And he's every Russian's favorite Democrat, I guess. There are rumblings that he's funded by the Russians. Have you heard those?
I've heard that, and I've heard that, you used to hear the same thing about Jill Stein in 2016, that the Russians were funding the campaign because she was the Green Party nominee because she had won Stein with a group of people and Vladimir Putin was there. So you always get this, and I know that Hillary Clinton had said it both about Jill Stein and suggested that in 2020 about Tulsi Gabbard, but I never saw any direct evidence that Tulsi Gabbard was somehow a Russian tribune.
Okay. So we're talking about how, this is Rich Rubino, by the way, political historian and commentator. I'm Bradley J, and we're talking about how did we get so divided. And the other, our history is actually quite short.
Interesting. I do want to say something about the 1960s, though, because
Yeah.
so Lady Bird Johnson in 64 campaigned on the Lady Bird Express, and she went to the South, and she campaigned, and she was getting racial epithets hurled at her everywhere she went. So this was people on the right who were disaffected with the Johnson administration. So Johnson, after 1964, one of the biggest landslides in American history, 61% of the vote, Vice President Hubert Humphrey and George Ball, the Assistant Secretary of State, were the only members of the administration who were opponents of proliferating in Vietnam. At one point, President Johnson went right around the table and he was asking members of administration, he said, should we continue the bombing campaign in Vietnam? And Hubert Humphrey said, no, Mr. President, I don't think so. You just won a landslide. This is your time to essentially get out. Humphrey was taken out of out of national security meetings. He came 1966. He took a trip to Vietnam. He came back a supporter of the Vietnam War. So how is this relevant? By 1965 to 1969, gradually more and more people on the left, a lot of them college students, start protesting President Johnson. Then if it got to the point where everywhere President Johnson went, people would literally sit in front of cars so that the motorcade could not go through. The Secret Service at one point warned him that they cannot guarantee that they will do everything they can for his safety, but basically military installations are the only place we can guarantee your safety. Certainly, if you went to a college campus, for example, they're going to be anti-Vietnam support. They're going to be opponents of the Vietnam War who are going to protest, and something could happen to you. So he scaled back his appearances. He still made them, but military installation was the only place that could guarantee his safety. So you have the phenomena where folks on the right are disaffected because he signed the Civil Rights Act, and on the left, hey, LBJ, how many boys would you kill today? Yelling this all over wherever he went, certainly in front of the White House, everywhere that he would go, he was kind of encapsulated in between, having protesters on one side and on the other, and he was kind of standing in the middle. There were also, in terms of Vietnam, there are folks who said we should use nuclear weapons to end the war. Then there are other people who said we should end the war right now. And Johnson was doing this gradual escalation. And eventually, 1968, he lost re-election. He didn't run for re-election, rather, because in the New Hampshire primary, he only won by 8 points against Eugene McCarthy, a senator from Minnesota. And Eugene McCarthy's entire plank basically was about ending the Vietnam War. And on the other side of that, Johnson had originally proposed a war on poverty. And this proliferated opposition again from the right wing of the Republican Party, said this is not necessarily the federal government's role, that this is essentially socialism, this is communism. So there was really this left-right phenomenon under the Johnson administration. I think that was really an inflection point. And then Richard Nixon comes in, takes over, and then in 1970, when he expanded the bombing campaign in Vietnam to Cambodia, there was a student moratorium. So we have certainly had these divisions. And at the time, just like at the time vote, it was the divisions, as they say, were very much inside both parties. Now, other than the division between the establishment and kind of the insurgent bloodline, the fact of the matter is most Republicans are conservative in Congress. Most Democrats are liberal. I can think of in the House of Representatives, Jared Golden of Maine is probably the only Democrat I can think of who I would say is probably conservative. Mary Peralta from Alaska is probably pretty close. On the Republicans, on the Democratic side in the Senate, probably Joe Manchin. That's about it. And on the Republican side, you could say who's a liberal Republican. The closest would probably be Susan Collins from Maine. But there really is very little actual divergences within the party.
So we have talked. You've spoken at length of examples of divisions, but you haven't given me a reason why we are so divided. I have a reason, but I'll let you go first. Or I would encourage you to go first.
Part of it, it started. By the way, it also a lot of this goes back to the Robert Bork nomination under Ronald Reagan, when the Democrats and Republicans were at swords on that. And then in 1994, Newt Gingrich's contract with America, he nationalized the elections. It used to be that you could vote for president, you can vote for a Democrat, but you know what? I really like my Republican because he's the one that got the funding for the community college. He brought this earmark here. Gingrich changed all that. Gingrich, that election, it was essentially he had 10 points, and almost every Republican candidate signed on to those plans, whether it was a balanced budget amendment, line item veto, getting rid of unfunded mandates. So they were running on national platforms. And now, when you have a congressional election, very rarely do candidates say, "I'm going to focus on local issues." And it's so much of it is on national issues. And if you're a conservative Democrat who's in a very conservative district, says, "You know what? I'm going to get elected. We're going to get rid of all this partisanship, and I'm just going to focus on bringing stuff to my district," the Republican will say, "Yeah, but you voted for the national level. You voted for the Republican president, the Democratic presidential candidate." And they very rarely have an answer to that. 2010, Gene Taylor in Mississippi said he actually voted for John McCain, the Republican nominee, in one of his last debates against Steve Pizzullo. Absolutely surprised everybody. But I also think the ideological silos, these ideological citadels, specifically social media. People aren't getting their news from Walter Cronkite or Huntley and Brinkley today. A lot of people are getting their news from sources on the internet, on Facebook, on all sorts of social media platforms where they agree. All you have to do, and it's in the human mind somewhere, we have an inclination. You want to hear news from people that you agree that already reinforces your preconceived notion. You don't want to. Rarely do people sit there and say, "I want to hear both sides of everything." They say, "No, I want to hear what I've already believed." And so as a result, what happened after Newt Gingrich in '94? Gradually, Fox News started airing in around 1996, and Fox News at the time was very kind of trans-ideological. It wasn't necessarily an ideological forum, but gradually they decided they're going to be a counterweight and say that the other side represents the liberal media, so we're going to be a counterweight to that. So from a business perspective, it was brilliant. Marketing became the number one network in terms of news networks in the country, and then MSNBC, which began actually very similar. It began, Keith Olbermann would have a show that was just very much straight news. They eventually moved to the left because it benefits their market share. And they're still then you have on the conservative side, you have One America, you have others say, well, Fox News isn't conservative enough. On the left side, you have other sources like Democracy Now!, which says, well, MSNBC and CNN, they're both corporatists. So, I think that it's a matter of you get more and more right or more and more left, and people are just getting the same information from the same sources that they want.
So you point to the Newt Gingrich as being a big change, sea change, if you will. Because he focused on the national agenda and made it more difficult for folks to concentrate on local issues, right?
Yes, and it's interesting. Actually, this is fascinating. So the Republicans picked up 54 seats that year. He became the first speaker since Joe Martin in 1954 that was a Republican. So it was 40 years since a Republican had controlled the House of Representatives. This is fascinating because he represented the 6th District of Georgia around Sandy Springs, Marietta, and his opponent. Remember the show Dukes of Hazzard?
Yes. Yeah, I remember it, but I have to be honest. I don't think I ever watched an entire episode.
Do you remember there was a guy named Cooter on it?
I've heard. I knew that there was. I couldn't point him out in a lineup.
Well, he was Ben Jones, and he had been a congressman from Georgia from 1989 to 1993. He was gerrymandered out. 1994, he runs in that district. He runs against Newt Gingrich. And Newt Gingrich is spending all of his time going all around the country campaigning for other Republicans, trying to nationalize the election. So he would not debate Ben Jones. So what did Ben Jones do? He got some bloodhounds, and he would go all over the country to fundraisers that Gingrich was at, and he'd stand in front and say, we want Newt Gingrich to debate. Why isn't Newt Gingrich debating? And Newt Gingrich would not address him directly. But this shows the reason I say this shows the difference. Ben Jones, if you look at his platform, he was saying, I'm going to focus on constituent service. There was a speech about a week before in Georgia to a business club, and Ben Jones's entire speech was about constituent service, how he was in Congress, he was so good at that, how we can bring stuff back to the district. Newt Gingrich was talking about how we're going to have to renew Western civilization. And you know what? Bottom line, Newt Gingrich defeated Ben Jones in the district overwhelmingly, and nationally, the Republicans took over the House of Representatives, and Newt Gingrich's main point by doing that was he made this a national platform.
Okay.
And he made this a referendum also on Bill Clinton. He says, if you support Bill Clinton, who was relatively unpopular at the time as a Democrat, then you cannot be, he says, either you support him or you don't support him. And they kind of let him kind of waffled on it. And you had other issues, for example, the ban on AK-47, on semi-automatic weapons. Many Democrats like Tom Foley in Washington State. This is fascinating. He's the Speaker of the House, the incumbent Speaker, the first Speaker to lose his own House seat since 1862. Tom Foley got a call from Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton says, I'm going to include the ban on semi-automatic weapons in the crime bill. Tom Foley says, if you do that, I'll let it come to the floor, but I'm going to lose in my district. And he did lose in his district. Jack Brooks, very unpopular congressman from Texas, he lost in his district because he voted for, on the final analysis, he voted for that crime bill. And this was a national issue, even though both of them had done a lot for their district. Tom Foley, certainly for the wheat farmers around Spokane, but when it comes down to it, that was a national election. And since then, just about every election has been national.
So I see two divisions at the ballot box and divisions on the street.
Yeah.
And a lot of what you address is the division at the ballot box. But why are people, the problem that's so irritating is people are ignoring what their parents told them is don't talk about, there's a reason why you don't talk about politics in person at the dinner table. It's just because it's dividing. Same with religion. Just shut up about it and keep your political views to yourself. There's a place for that. That's the ballot box. And so that's part one. Shut up about your politics. And number two is especially shut up about it on social media. I agree with you 100% on the social media. It used to be there was news that was, and there was a desire to have news that was factual, not opinion. So people have ceased to shut up about their politics. There is no news anymore. None. Zero. Where's the news? It's all opinion. Where's the news?
There is some. I mean, Scripps Howard, I think, tries to do a pretty good job. I think so, yeah. I think there are, I mean, obviously, look, nobody's going to be completely impartial. Just the fact we choose which story you're going to emphasize.
I understand the editorial fact, but, that can be decided upon the things that you think impact the people the most. I mean, that's how you should do your editorializing. Your choices should be based on what matters most. Anyway, people find a two-pronged thing, no longer have the desire to shut up about their politics, and they have this tool called the internet, which gives them a voice, and that's the thing. The answer is really stop. You don't really need to watch the news so much. Watch it. Find actual news if you can. Factual news. Try to be interested in the facts and not opinion. Have your antennae out for opinion rather than facts, and then shut up about it on social media. Don't talk about it on social media. If somebody starts spouting politics on your social media, block them. And there's a lot of wisdom from the Greeks. They were wise. Even your parents were wise. That they had experience in talking about politics and having it be bad, and we should go back to shutting up about our politics and just voting and not having politics be everybody's hobby. There's so many people talking politics who are wildly unqualified, and I will go as far as to say that, and this will be controversial, Not everyone should have a voice. Today, everyone has a voice. It's on their phone. But it used to be that you had to be vetted to have a voice. You used to have to prove that you knew what you were talking about, that you were kind of relatively unbiased, and that you had good character. You got vetted through the system. I mean, Walter Cronkite didn't just show up,
Right.
and you had to prove yourself first. You were qualified to have a voice. Now, very few people are qualified to have a voice, and they shouldn't have a voice.
You know,
They should shut up.
it's interesting what you said, because this is something that's different. In the 1960s, people, especially young people, had to have a voice because of draft status. If you didn't want to go to Vietnam, you were afraid of going to Vietnam. You're afraid of being drafted. So as a result, people were on the streets protesting. Today, you can actually be very depoliticized. And there are plenty of Americans that are depoliticized, that don't follow politics whatsoever. There are millions and millions of Americans, the great kind of, it's almost a plurality, that literally do not vote, that don't vote, that don't participate, that it maybe can name maybe they'll name Joe Biden, maybe they'll name Kamala Harris. And if you ask them to name any other politicians, they don't know. I've talked to people that said, well, I think I've had conversations. They said, well, I think Nancy Pelosi's going to lose re-election next time. I said, why is that? They said, well, she represents California, and there are a lot of conservative people in California. I said, no, she represents San Francisco. They don't understand that the difference between the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. They think she represents the whole state. I've had someone tell me, I have an idea of how we can balance the federal budget. I said, how's that? He said, well, right now, each state has 2 senators. I said, yep. He says, one has to be a Republican, one has to be a Democrat. I said, really? And the guy says, well, here's what you do. Each state only gets 1 senator, and the people get to pick what party that senator is going to be in. So it's only going to be 50 senators, and we're going to balance the budget that way. And I said, oh, so each state has to have 1 senator from each party, and the reason that we have a deficit is because of politicians' salaries. And he's like, yes. So there's a lot of ignorance out there. And you know what? These people that are ignorant, that are completely depoliticized, they can certainly do that, and they can have a pretty normal life, because we're not necessarily worrying about, for example, being drafted. And that's something you did not have in the 60s. You certainly did not have that in the Civil War. And also, I would say, though, the people on Twitter, 75% of the country is not on Twitter. Particularly older Americans are not on these social media platforms. And the people that you do hear from, the people that are on social media platforms all day, they're really the minority. It's just that they're the most vociferous, and they're usually the people on the extremes that write. Very rarely do you see moderates writing on Facebook. It's usually the people on the extremes, the people that are most vocal, and often the people, by the way, who vote in the primaries. And you think that they have more of an outsized voice, but in reality, they're actually a very small contingent. They're just the same ones. If you look at your Facebook feed, you can probably think of maybe 11 people that are on there just vociferously all day long. But think of the majority of people that either don't post on Facebook whatsoever, that maybe have an account and don't do anything with it, or that just don't post about politics. And you'll see that the majority of them are not that kind of hard-boiled ideologues.
So, a wise question from Phil Kate. He says, "If we don't talk about politics, how do we learn?" And I've had
wisdom,
3 minutes to think about that. And I guess my response would be, what have I learned by talking politics to someone who is an unvetted person? Joe Schmo. What do I learn by talking to Joe Schmo, whose political views are in cement, who's never going to change? I'm not learning anything from them. I mean, so perhaps saying never talk about politics with anyone is not a solution, but not talking with people I don't know their bona fides. Is that how you say it?
Bona fides, yes.
On social media, that I'm not learning anything from social media.
The only thing you are learning is you're learning about ignorance of people.
Oh.
You're learning what people think and where they come. Where you learn sometimes, and sometimes, frankly, you learn that people fit the stereotypes. If somebody says something, you might say, "Where did this person come from?" And then you look at their profile page, and you can almost pick. You can say, "This person believes this because they come from a very conservative part of the country. this person believes this because they come from a very liberal part of the country. Actually, the people I find fascinating are the people that don't fit those stereotypes. If, for example, you see a rural white Southerner and the rural white Southerner is defending the Democratic Party, you say, huh, that's different. This person's actually, if they come, especially if they come from a conservative family and they're not conservative on the internet, you say this person thinks for themselves. Or contrary-wise, if you see somebody who is a college student at UC Berkeley, and that college student at UC Berkeley is out there writing about what a great senator Mitch McConnell is, you say, well, he probably doesn't come from a liberal family, but somehow this person has come to that conclusion. They've arrived at that conclusion respectively, probably on their own. I mean, because there are so many people who it's about, it's kind of the nature versus nurture argument in psychology. So much of it is about how they're nurtured. And there's so many people that come from different areas and they think a certain way and they've never changed anything, their views on anything. And they believe that they're essentially on the side of God and the other side is essentially the side of the devil. But anybody who's kind of, or somebody who's changed their ideology, somebody who supported, Ralph Nader in 2000, then supported George W. Bush in 2004, you look at those people and you say, how did they get to those conclusions? At least they're people who think for themselves. At least they're not people that just blindly follow an ideology from their parents, from their environment, or they try to fit in with people.
There's so much of this. There's so much of that. Okay, this is a crucial question, which is a follow-up to to something I said. Okay, who's qualified to give an opinion? I have an answer to that too.
Yes.
And my answer would be kind of a backdoor answer, and that is, instead of saying who is qualified, I'll say let's eliminate the people not qualified. And if I don't know your qualifications, I'm not going to assume you're qualified. So anyone on social media, I don't know where you're coming from, or I don't know what your qualifications are, I'm going to ignore you. And then the thing that addresses both how do we learn and how do we decide who's qualified to give an opinion might not really need to know. I don't really need an opinion or want an opinion. I'm trying to get facts, and the only real way I can think of is to get facts. The only real way I can think of to really get facts, or come as close as you can to it, is observe the right, watch Fox.
Yep.
Observe the left, knowing it's the left, and only take as fact the things that overlap. There are certain things that are so obviously facts that they have to say X is Y or whatever, and they both acknowledge that. Whatever they all acknowledge, I'm more likely to take as a fact. Like, so-and-so did something, it's on videotape, there it is, I'm seeing the videotape on Fox, I'm seeing the videotape here, this person said this, probably a fact. Other than that, I should ignore any stuff that surrounds that fact. Mm-hmm. You have a sphere of Fox and you have a sphere of MSNBC, and those two overlap, and whatever's in that overlap, I'm going to say is probably a fact, because they neither would acknowledge it unless they had to, because it was a fact. But that's as close as I can come.
But I think that what you hear on either it's MSNBC or Fox, they're not just making stuff up. There's some fact. It's what they do with the fact. It's how they manipulate the fact. They're saying something. It's like a political advertisement. When a candidate runs an advertisement, they're not just making something up. They're not saying, if you hear somebody voted 700 for, if you hear, for example, a candidate says, my opponent voted for tax increases 700 times. They didn't just make that out of thin air. It's probably technically true. There was probably some provision in some bill that raised the taxes, $100,000 on some certain industry or something. So they use that so that Americans will look at that and they'll think, well, he raised taxes on everybody. So, but technically they're telling the truth. Very rarely do you hear an actual, somebody just mendaciously come out. They're not going to say, this person was, you're not going to say, Rod Blagojevich, the former governor of Illinois, has become Donald Trump's running mate. Because people would look and they'd say, okay, where did you get that from? And they call Rod Blagojevich, or Blagojevich says, what are you talking about? Now, if they'll say, but they will say something that's certainly technically true. It's just a matter they manipulate the facts, and obviously they cherry pick certain bits of evidence, just like we saw, for example, during the Iraq War. They would in many respects there was cherry picking of intelligence. You pick what you want and you make the case that way. But also, you talk about MSNBC and Fox. The funny thing is, when you talk to people on the far right and the far left, The far left is not watching MSNBC because they think that they're a corporate shill. They're watching essentially folks like One America. There are other sources on the far left, and the folks on the right, not necessarily watching Fox, they might be watching Newsmax. They might be watching One America because they think Fox is too corporatist, too establishment. So you do kind of, but back to, you know, you've so far mentioned your original point. Basically, it's a matter of critical thinking. It's like there's his story, there's her story, like in relationships, and there's the truth. And you just have to kind of figure out what the actual truth is. And usually both sides have a little bit of the truth. It's a matter of they're distorting it for their own market share.
More good questions from Phil, Kate. Should we restrict the right to vote? The ultimate offering of an opinion. I guess that first, is that the ultimate offering of an opinion, or is that an act? You know, if I put a piece of wood in that pile versus that pile, is that an opinion? Yeah, kinda, but I'm not opining on why I'm putting the piece of wood in that pile. I'm just doing the act. But should we restrict the right to vote? Well, maybe they should. See, you run into difficulty because
it's almost like a poll test then, like they used to do with
right, and that would be a problem because of language barriers and educational barriers. So probably not. It would be if all other things would be equal. If everybody had the same opportunities, there might be. I don't know. I suppose you can't because really, you really don't. It's not. You don't need to know. Let me back up. The vote really is so you will get to do what's best for you or what you perceive is best for you. So you don't really have to be right about anything. So you don't need to. You don't need to have a certain level of education or knowledge about anything. In America, you just vote in a way that you think will benefit you. And I want to pay less taxes. I want to pay less taxes. I don't need to know anything about anything except I want to pay fewer, Phil, fewer taxes, less tax. And so the answer is no. We should not restrict the right to vote for the reasons given. Wayne says, Bradley, what would you consider? What would you consider qualifications? Well, one would be if someone is clearly a cheerleader for one side or the other. Well, you got to, that's a problem for me. I guess this is a good time to say that really in this country you deserve the government you get. You also deserve the news you get. The reason that we don't get news is because people don't want news. If people wanted news, if it were in demand, it would be supplied. No one wants a Walter Cronkite. No one wants the facts if it were perceived by the news providers that people wanted facts and would pay and would watch, and they could then sell more advertising because more people are watching because they want the news, then they would do that. But nobody wants the news anymore. They want their own opinions to be massaged, which is so I have to blame the people really in this system, in this supply and demand system. There's no rule that says these news organizations have to do that, and some of them may be ideologically motivated, but mostly they're motivated by money. And if they could make more money providing the facts, then they probably would. So I blame us. We are to blame.
It's interesting what you just said. It reminds me of, remember Dean Acheson, who was Harry Truman's Secretary of State?
Oh, yeah.
You remember him?
Yeah.
Dean, the guy with the mustache, one of the wise men during
Dean
Vietnam.
and I go way back.
Yeah, your homie Dean Acheson.
Yep.
He was once asked if he thinks Congress is representative of the people. And he says, I actually think Congress should be less representative of the people because he said the people are too stupid.
Well, then we get back into Plato's philosopher king theory. Plato didn't believe that people were able to govern themselves, and he wanted a class of people to be from birth groomed to
Yeah.
be philosopher kings. And, he might have something. Are the people really, are the people
Aristotle, too.
really qualified to govern themselves? I don't know.
Well, I was going to say Aristotle too believed in a polity. He believed essentially kind of an amalgamation. On the one hand, he was against autocracy, but he was also against democracy. And you say the word democracy, there are obviously different forms of democracy. A complete Athenian version of democracy. Everyone gets there at a town meeting, and someone wants to vote on the agricultural appropriations bill. Everyone gets together. It's a majority, and the majority and whichever one's the majority, whether that bill passes or it doesn't pass, that's kind of true democracy. And then you have the version we have, representational democracy or a constitutional republic, where essentially we elect people to make the decisions for us. And that's essentially the system that we have in the United States. Ross Perot, when he ran in '92, talked about the idea of electronic town halls, where everyone could kind of sit there on their computers and a piece of legislation would come up and the people anyone who wanted to could actually vote directly on that legislation. You still have this, by the way, in town meetings.
Actually, I'm a little worried about hacks and stuff.
Oh, there's plenty. I mean,
I'm not down with that. I would like to. You could have ballot questions pop up, and everybody in the United States, we have a pop up vote coming up. Get online, but I wouldn't trust it.
You see that actually sometimes when you see polls. And for example, supporters of one particular candidate who's at 0% and 1% in the polls will say, all right, we want to make it, when this poll comes out, we want to make it look like this candidate has a lot more support. So all these people just come, and all of a sudden you look at this, and all of a sudden this guy's got like 10%, and you say, who is this guy? And you get name recognition. Actually, in New Hampshire, there's a place called Dixville Notch. And Dixville Notch.
Yeah.
That's it's way up in the northern part of New Hampshire.
That's the first town to report, right?
Yes. Because under New Hampshire,
and there's only 7 people living there.
The reason that is, by the way, under New Hampshire statute, if a town has under 100 people, under 100 registered voters, if every single voter that's registered votes, has voted, they can close the polls right away. So there's one hotel up there, and basically there's about 7 employees of that hotel. So they vote, and then all the media gets up there because these are the first returns. This happens both in the primary and in the general election, because they say, oh, well, we got the first returns, 1201. What happens at Dixville Notch? So what happens is there's a very obscure candidate. Let's say in the general election, let's say a Libertarian or a Green Party. In the presidential election, let's say it's somebody like Perry Johnson or Steve Laffey, who used to be the mayor of Cranston, Rhode Island, who's no one ever heard of. He goes up and lobbies. He goes up all the way to Dixville Notch and talks to one person that works at that hotel and says, I really need your vote because this is going to get us a lot of publicity. Then they report every network in the country. The first story is going to be, well, the first turns are coming from Dixville Notch, and the votes are, we have 5 votes on the Republican side, we have 5 votes for Donald Trump, we have 3 votes for Tim Scott, and we have 1 vote for Steve Laffey. And they'll say, well, John, who is this Steve Laffey? And you know what? Steve Laffey starts raising money. People go to his website. People know who he is. So it's very much, they're very much, the point is they lobby that person. Not that someone in Dixville not necessarily a better or more informed voter than anybody else. They're just in the right place at the right time.
By the way, up in Dixville Notch, that hotel is a resort called the Balsams.
Have you been there?
I've driven by and looked at it longingly, but it was too expensive. I guess it's we've been doing this an hour, and I should probably take the dog out. So and save some. This is a good one, and I really like it because
the dog out.
I think there's a good balance today between the nitty gritty history and a talk about how we live in our life, how we are living our lives today. I just got to say, as a personal thing, I'm much happier keeping my news consumption to a minimum. What you know what I do? I go on YouTube. I spend $12.
A lot of that too. And C-SPAN is absolutely great because C-SPAN, if you look at the anchors, the people who do the call-in shows, you can never figure out their ideological predisposition.
Okay, good. So I watch what pops up, and stuff pops up from all over the place. Oh, this little chunk comes from Fox. This little chunk comes from Brian Cohen. This chunk comes from Glenn Kirshner. This chunk comes from MSNBC. And I try to get a whole wash of stuff. I cannot stand network television because of the commercials. can't take it. Cannot take it anymore. People trying to create a fake need that, I can't be a man because my don't smoke the right brand of cigarettes, whatever, like the Rolling Satisfaction song. A man telling me how white my shirt should be. I can't stand the commercials, and it's so worth the $12 to not see any commercials ever.
I just want to end with this because this is fascinating what you said about that. Imagine this happening today. In 1927, Charles Curtis was the Senate Majority Leader, a senator from Kansas. He became vice president under Herbert Hoover, actually the first minority vice president because he was 1/8 Indian. And when he was in the Senate, he made some money by representing Lucky Strikes, the cigarette.
Yeah.
And he was actually in their advertisements. And in one of their advertisements, in their newspaper articles, he said, "I've noticed a lot of my colleagues have been using Lucky Strikes, and I do the Lucky Strikes as well. Lucky Strikes are great on the throat." Now imagine today.
Great on the throat?
Yes. Imagine today if, say, Mitch McConnell or Hiram Jeffries or someone in the United States Congress decided they're going to make some money by representing a cigarette company and promoting that and saying, "My colleagues do that as well."
I have a quiz for you. What does this stand for?
LSMFT. No ideation.
No ideation. He has no ideation, folks. Drum roll, please. Lucky Strike means fine tobacco.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. I thought you knew everything, man.
No, I don't know that. I don't even smoke.
That was a thing. That was one of their sayings. You're not old enough.
I'm
Probably.
not old enough to smoke? No, I'm thinking of starting, though.
Yeah, okay. By the way, and this is for Phil Kate. Saves me an email. Because the cigarettes here. And you might want to try this too. There's an audiobook. There's a book and an audiobook called Atomic Habits.
Oh, interesting.
And it really breaks down, first of all, it shows how really our lives are not made of living with a few habits. Our lives are all a series of habits, and how they're formed and tricks to break them, the bad ones, and tricks to institute good ones. And I listened to it over and over, and it's very helpful. Atomic Habits cost me $14. Completely worth it for me. Even if it's not worth it for you, it's only $14. It was worth a stab. Even if you get one better habit or get rid of one bad habit, it's good. Atomic Habits. And listen, at first when you listen to it, you'll say, this is kind of mamby-pamby. But it gets very, very, very specific. Atomic Habits. All right. I got to go edit some video. I have all kinds of stuff I have to do, believe it or not, in my retirement. What's this? Wayne says, no East Coast polls reported for West Coast. Oh, there's a little...
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, I'm backing up now. Wayne Greenside. It's always bothered me a little that the vote returns are reported in the national news before many people have a chance to vote. People want to vote for a winner, and those early returns influence the later voters. Yeah, that's true, I guess. Wayne, I thought the results were not broadcast until the polls were closed. Yes, closed. Polls closed, but not all reported. But I see what you're saying. Results not broadcast. Is that true? No results are broadcast until the polls close on the East Coast, on the West Coast? I don't know the answer to that. Wayne says no. East Coast polls are reported before West Coast polls close. Phil, okay. Thank you.
This is fascinating because this is really fascinating. In 1980, the East Coast polls came in and before the Western time zone, and Jimmy Carter knew he was going to lose, so he conceded early. Okay? This probably cost the Democratic Party about 15 seats. So what happened was, on the Democratic side, in the West Coast, a lot of Democrats were so aggravated because they saw Ronald Reagan was going to win. They got depressed. They did not come out to vote. Tip O'Neill was extremely incensed by this because he said that Jimmy Carter probably cost us about 15 seats because he said if Jimmy Carter, what he should have done, he should have not conceded until the election in all these places was over. And he said that was essentially his argument, was that you don't concede because all these people didn't come out and they didn't vote for a congressman as well. So people that were going to vote for Jimmy Carter would have also likely voted for a Democrat for the House and for the Senate. So they said, well, because the presidential election is obviously the election people think is most paramount, the most important, the flagship election. So people came out and they voted for, if they didn't come out, rather, Tip O'Neill blamed a lot of that on Jimmy Carter. That's why you don't concede until basically all the elections, all the states are decided.
Speaking of elections, do you think that things have changed in the states so that we are more or less likely to have a repeat of the 2020 doubting the results of the election?
Yeah, I think we do. I think absolutely.
I think it's a real danger.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to see a scenario if Donald Trump wins the nomination and it's a very close election, and Donald Trump and it's a disputed election. It's hard for me to see a scenario, unless it's an absolute electoral landslide, where Donald Trump would come out and would say, I lost the election and I concede to Joe Biden. Now, can you see on the other side as well? If it's a really close election, would Joe Biden concede to Donald Trump? My guess is he would say we have to go through, like Al Gore did. He say we have to go through the process. Maybe that'd be a legal process. Maybe it would go to the Supreme Court like it did after 36 days back in 2000. But I can totally see that scenario, in part just because we're so bifurcated. 94% of Republicans voted for Trump last time. 94% of Democrats voted for Joe Biden. This country is so divided in that respect. So you don't see a scenario where one person can, like Lyndon Johnson winning 44 states, Franklin Roosevelt only losing 2 states, Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon only losing 1 state, George H.W. Bush winning 40 states. I just don't see that scenario where you're going to have a landslide in a long time.
Okay, let's wrap this up. I want to reiterate my long shot prediction that neither Trump nor DeSantis will be the nominee. And I think I'm starting to see things roll in my direction when it comes to DeSantis. I heard James Carville say today that DeSantis would not be number 2. It would be someone else. And I think he said
on a Trump ticket, you mean?
No.
Oh,
as a nominee.
It will be. I agree with that. I do think it's probably. I think DeSantis. I think DeSantis in very much is kind of inflating. Part of it is kind of his off-putting personality in many respects. I think there's going to be in every election cycle. There's somebody a dark horse that people are not thinking of. Bill Clinton was at 1% in March of 1991. He wins the nomination. Jimmy Carter, 1974. Yeah. There was a poll, 35 candidates, a Harris poll. Jimmy Carter wasn't even on the list of potential Democratic candidates. There's always somebody. Howard Dean, although he didn't win, he was at about 1% when he announced. He landed up being the front runner for many months that year. So it's going to be somebody. The question is who, and they have to get on. They probably have to get on the debate stage August 30th in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for that first debate. And they're all trying to do that. Chris Christie just qualified. Doug Burgum of North Dakota is certainly trying, but I think there's going to be somebody that's going to proliferate and is going to come into those kind of that top 3. But I don't see a scenario right now where DeSantis is not in the top 3, but I can see where there'd be somebody right in the first.
Phil Kate says, has James Carville been vetted? Yes.
Well, yes.
Answer is yes.
Yes, because he got Zell Miller elected governor of 1990, Harris Wofford, United States Senator in Pennsylvania in 1991, and Bill Clinton elected president in 1992. And he did this despite the fact that in the primaries, you had the Jennifer Flowers issue, you had the draft issue, you had the fact that, it was absolute genius that this is why he was so brilliant, in part because he was one of the ones that came up with the strategy. Bill Clinton lost New Hampshire by 9 points. Paul Tsongas won the state of New Hampshire. But he said, Bill, you were down in the polls, now you come up, you're going to declare yourself the comeback kid. And that worked for him, so he had the perfect strategy, and he won those 3 campaigns.
So, speaking of Carville, he said that he thought if something happened to Trump, it wouldn't be DeSantis, but maybe J.D. Vance. Does that make any sense?
You mean I did hear him say that. No, it doesn't. He's somebody, by the way, that Marjorie Taylor Greene supported in the primary and actually campaigned for him in the primary. He's somebody who he's a first-term senator. He won. He wrote the Hillbilly Elegy. He's a first-term senator from Ohio. He beat Tim Ryan the last time around. Very, very conservative United States senator. I think the way he said it, though, he was kind of saying, he was kind of rambling. He's like, oh, well, maybe it'll be J.D. Vance. No, I don't think J.D. Vance would be his successor.
So you see Christie's, starting to shine a little bit, or you got no hope for Christie either?
It's hard to see a scenario where somebody other than Donald Trump actually wins the nomination. Never mind somebody who is
Something could happen.
polarized against Donald Trump.
There's so many loose things floating around out there with Trump that I don't know. Something could happen, and
I think if it's not Trump, it'll be somebody who has a similar ideological disposition. Maybe not necessarily the style of Donald Trump. I think DeSantis is expecting that. He's thinking he's going to be the second choice for. But honestly, for Ron DeSantis, from a pure, cold, calculated political strategy, he would have been better off. He just won re-election, served out his full term as governor of Florida. Then, whether if Trump wins or Trump loses, by 2028, he's still in Donald Trump's good graces. Potentially, he could have been that heir apparent or that successor to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump may have even endorsed him. Now he's got the scenario where he's second to Donald Trump, and if he loses to Donald Trump this time around, I really don't see a scenario by 2028 or any other future election where people are saying, let's bring back Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis is going to essentially be what somebody like Howard Dean was, somebody that, shot up really fast and then dissipated, and then you never hear from them at the presidential level again.
Marjorie Taylor Greene, would she ever be a vice presidential shot with Trump?
No, because
especially now that she's a little bit more mainstream.
No, because I think Trump really wants to win, and
also because Trump doesn't like people who are in the spotlight more than he is. That's why he likes Pence, Mr. Meek and mild. Wayne Greenside says, "I wish that debate host would not let a debater dodge a question." Yes, that's true, but if I were Biden and I were debating Trump, somebody asked me a question and I'm Joe Biden, I would say, well, I don't know about that, Bob, but I do know that President Trump said that COVID would be no big deal. Next question. What do you think about this, President Biden? Well, I don't know much about that, but I do know that President Trump sat there after having taken the oath of office to defend our country from enemies, foreign and domestic, while the Capitol was overrun by domestic enemies. So I get what you're saying, Wayne, but if it were me, I would answer the question asked me in 5 seconds and spend the rest of the time pointing out all the bad and horrible stuff my enemy did.
But
I completely get that.
But you do have to actually, you can't say, you do have to actually.
I won't say I don't know, but
you don't say I don't know. You give the answer. You say, well, right, blah blah blah, and then you go on, and then
okay, President Biden, do you see yourself continuing in Ukraine, supplying, giving military aid? Yes, I do, and
yeah,
I like to take the remaining 55 seconds to point out that President Trump said this or President Trump said that, and vice versa. I mean, I completely get that. That would be my strategy. Answer the question in 5 seconds, beat up on the guy for the other candidate for the next 55 seconds. Whatever.
This was exemplified in 1994 when George W. Bush was debating Ann Richards. Ann Richards, the incumbent governor of Texas, very popular, actually had a 60% job approval rating on election day. George W. Bush, they asked him about Harkin Energy. They asked him about anything. His answer would be, he'd answer it in 5 seconds, and then he'd say, "But you know what? What we really need, our children need to learn. We need tort reform. We need juvenile justice reform, and we need a tax cut." He would answer that with just about everything. And Richards gives these intellectual answers, but you know what? At the end of the day, everyone knew what George W. Bush's message were. These were 4 poll-tested issues that people in Texas wanted, and George W. Bush upended Ann Richards.
So that's dangerous. It can be dangerous if you do it wrong and you're a dunce like Rubio.
Oh,
he said the same thing over and over, and he got burned by Christie for it, right?
Yes, because he kept saying the notion that Barack Obama does not know what he is doing is a fiction. Barack Obama knows exactly what he is doing.
I don't get why
Christie called him out on that. And
I
there was a
don't get how
robot that walked all over New Hampshire that said the Marco Rubio robot that would be walking around, that would say that same thing over and over and over again. The dumb thing about Marco Rubio, even after Chris Christie called him out on it, the next question, he still answered it that way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. This has been wonderful. Thanks to Phil, Kate, and Wayne, and Will for Will says, thanks for the great show today. Hombres.
Oh.
How I like that. Hombres.
I do too. That would be a great name for the show.
No. No, don't. Hombres? All right, we'll take a break here for a week, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you, everyone, and thank you very much. Is there anything I'm forgetting to do? No. I guess that's it. Talk to you